When I was a kid, I had terrible eyesight. I didn't know I had terrible eyesight. As far as I was concerned, I couldn't see any worse or any better than anyone else. It never occurred to me that I couldn't see. Until one day, when I was in fourth grade, I brought my binoculars to class. So in fourth grade, that's what tipped them off that maybe I couldn't see too well. Once I got the glasses, I started to reflect on what I hadn't been able to see before. What I had done is I had just made sense of the world as best I could, given what I could see. For example, when I played baseball, the coach would constantly say that you should keep your eye on the ball. And everybody knows what that means. Well, I know now. It means you watch the ball from the time it leaves the pitcher's hand to the time it hits your bat. Well, when I played baseball, I couldn't see that well. So, as far as I was concerned, it meant concentrate. Keep your eye, keep yourself on the ball. Work harder. That's the only way that phrase made sense to me. And what I want to suggest to you is that your students come to you half blind, and they make sense of the world as best they can, but it doesn't make sense to them. They don't understand, and they don't know that they're blind. They don't know what they don't know. They assume that they're doing just fine. And I would suggest that the same really does apply to a lot of your professors. A lot of professors have not really carefully thought through what it is that their students are learning from what they're teaching. And you might even apply it to yourselves as administrators in this audience. When I first began my job as a teacher, as a professor at a small institution in eastern Pennsylvania, I did a terrible job. I was an awful teacher. It wasn't from lack of trying. It was because I came from a culture outside of that of my students, and because I scared them. I was trying to teach them the way that I had been taught. I had gone to a college called Hampshire College, which was a little place in western Massachusetts, and I tried to teach my students in a small university in eastern Pennsylvania the way that I had been taught. And it didn't work. And I was terrified. I thought I was going to lose my job, and I couldn't afford that. I couldn't understand why the students didn't understand me. And so I turned to my colleagues, and I asked them how they taught. And I watched them teach their class. And I have very talented, very smart colleagues. And I began to imitate them. And what I found was that when I worked within the culture of what the students wanted, and as long as I didn't push the students too hard, I could get pretty close to 100% positive teaching evaluations. But what I found was that this didn't quite fit the way I wanted to do things. So I decided to risk my job. I decided to experiment in more measured ways, right? I didn't give it all up. And I began to try different things in class, and sometimes I scared the students, and sometimes things didn't work. But what I found over time is that I was able to utterly transform the way I taught. That I was able to get closer to the values that I had learned in a small liberal arts school in western Massachusetts, and that I had grown up with, but I guess more importantly, that just fit me. And the breakthroughs came from speaking with professors of pedagogy, with education professors. What I found was that whatever I came up with, they'd heard of before. They would tell me what it was called, and they would send me back to the literature. And then I could extrapolate from what I learned and generalize from it, and I began to learn a language of pedagogy. Probably the most important thing that they taught me was something called Bloom's taxonomy. What I told them, what I told different professors, is that I wanted to be more precise in what I was asking of my students. And one of the things that I learned is that one of the hardest things for my students to do is analysis. So much so that when I ask them to do analysis often, and you notice it's toward the top of this pyramid, the top of this triangle, they don't know what it means. When I say to them, analyze, what they hear is describe more. What they hear is use a thesaurus. What they hear is write more. What they hear is figure out what your professor wants. So what I've learned to do is use these division, this taxonomy of knowledge, to try and build a ladder for my students. And there's a lot of different ways of picturing Bloom's taxonomy. Here's Bloom's garden, right? My favorite picture for Bloom's taxonomy, or for this iterative process of learning, is this wheel that begins, I do. You notice at the top, you're demonstrating for the students. At the bottom of the wheel, they're doing it with you, and by the end, they're doing it themselves. This constant moving towards independence and self-motivation. But I was still stuck with a problem of how to talk about this with the students in a way that made sense to them. I went to see the University Jazz Ensemble play, and I noticed something that really amazed me. This was a class. It was a 50-minute class, but it was a class in jazz. And the way it worked is the professor would walk in, he'd walk to the lectern, the students would go quiet with their instruments, and there was a trombonist and a saxophonist and a trumpet player, and trumpet players, and there was drums, and there was a piano, and jazz guitar. And Kevin Jose, who was the band director, would walk up to the podium and he would say, 27. Measure 27. And then he would count them in, and they would play. And then he'd stop them, and he'd give instruction. He'd say, less pedal on the piano. He'd say, I need a more dynamic sound from those trumpets. And he'd go and he'd coach them individually. And then he'd play it again and again and again. And then I could see the students looking at each other midway through this process with delight, because they noticed that it sounded different. It sounded better. They practiced it at home. They practiced in sections. They learned the material. And then when they came together in the jazz band, they added the musicality. They rehearsed it together, and I began to use the language of rehearsal in my classroom. I said, you're going to practice this at home. You're going to post up your conclusions on course management software. I'll read them before class. And then in class, you'll write it again. You'll rehearse it again, and then I'll call on you, and you'll get a chance to try and explain it again. And it's been wonderful. What I was still missing, and again, this goes back to the culture of grades, the culture of the classroom, the culture of the university, was a way to value that, to assess it using grades. And I actually got this main breakthrough came from talking with a psychology professor who said, what you're talking about when you talk about these different categories is you're essentially talking about what we call in statistics fuzzy logic or qualitative comparative analysis. And so I went online and I looked up qualitative comparative analysis and I learned about it. And this is what it looks like. I mean, this is an extremely, extremely simple version. Each square is worth 1 point, and you notice there's 3 sections of the class: Columbian Exchange, Revolution, and Civil War, right? It's an intro, first half of the U.S. history survey. And so for the first third of the course, they have to do decent work. They need to do basically B-level work, is what I say to them. B minus. I need a good faith effort. And if they do that, they get the full point. They get 100%. If they amaze me, I'll give them 1.2 points. 1.2. And then you notice that's 120%. What it ends up happening is that the students begin to take responsibility for their work. If they do it and it's not good enough, they go back and they do it again. And it's worked incredibly well. The next breakthrough, I'm not sure. I've noticed this semester that the students who've had me before tend to act a little differently from the students who haven't had me before. The students who have had me before will take an assignment, and then when we talk about it in class, they'll talk not just about the assignment, but about what they've looked up outside of class. The JSTOR articles, the scholarly articles that they have looked up to tell them more, and they're interested more in the elements of the assignment that pertain to their own interests, to their own areas of excitement. And they're more open to the notion that they might actually find this material interesting. It's reflection that I think has really been the breakthrough. The fact that you notice the bottom row here, these are all essays where I ask the students to reflect on what works for them, what has caused them to become better students. Now, I'm not saying that this is going to work for anyone in this room. My argument is not that I've become a transformational teacher, that my teaching is transformed, that the students' learning in my classes has been transformed because I've followed a specific model. What I'm trying to argue to you is that this thing you're trying to do, you're trying to transform your students' lives. You're trying to convince them that they're blind. You're trying to hand them a new pair of glasses. You're trying to challenge their very self-image. And to do this, you need to put the effort in. Or if you're administrators, you need to support your professors as they put their effort in. It takes fully as much effort as scholarship. It takes fully as much intellectual effort as scholarship. And it is as idiosyncratic as scholarship as well. It is a matter of figuring out how you communicate what's most important to you and translating it for your students. You know, when I took those binoculars to class in 4th grade, the teachers called my parents, and they told my parents what I had done. And they decided I needed to wear glasses, and I didn't want them, and I didn't think I needed them. I had solved the problem of not being able to see the board. I brought in binoculars, and it never occurred to me that I needed my glasses for anything else. But I also remember what it felt like to put those glasses on for the very first time, and to walk outside and to notice that the rain had drops, that the trees had leaves, that people had faces, that there was detail and a depth to the world that I had never imagined. This is your job. You need to convince your students that they're blind, that you can help them, and that the world is worth seeing whole. It's a difficult job, but it's worth doing.